Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Connor Kelly, an early career fellow here at Balliol, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone this evening to this online lecture. My role this evening is to act as a facilitator and to introduce our speaker, Professor Kimberley Johnson, who will shortly be giving a lecture entitled The End of Black Politics. Professor Johnson is the John G. Winant Visiting Professor of American Government. She is also Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. She's the author of two books, Reforming Jim Crow, published in 2010, and Governing the American State, which was published in 2007. She has also written numerous academic articles on American political development and its intersection with racial and ethnic politics. Her current research projects focus on African American urban and suburban politics. She is completing a book manuscript, which is tentatively titled Dark Concrete, Exploring the Development of Black Power Urbanism in Newark and East Orange, New Jersey, and Oakland and East Palo Alto, California. On a personal note, I think things are moving at such speed in the United States that I would struggle to understand what is happening in any normal set of circumstances, but having Professor Johnson around Balliol in recent months to make some sense of it all has been really invaluable. So I think I'm right in saying that I am not the only Balliol Fellow that has really enjoyed being able to rely on her expertise on America in these very unusual times. And I'm quite confident that that insight on the United States is about to be extended again to our members who have joined us online this evening. So the final thing to run through are some technical details. We will shortly hear the lecture from Professor Johnson, and I will disappear from your screens. Once the lecture is finished, I'll return and lead a Q&A session. We would really encourage questions from everyone in attendance online today. You can put your questions during the lecture or after the lecture in the Q&A button, and I will read them out on your behalf during the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Johnson to give her lecture on the end of Black politics.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I too will say that things are progressing so fast and so quickly in the United States that I'm really not quite sure what to say about what's going on. But hopefully, over the course of the next half hour or so, my talk will allow us to think a little bit more about the sort of history of American politics, particularly Black politics, and then what might come in the future. So I'm going to start with thinking about, or just mentioning, obviously the big thing in the room, which is the election of Donald Trump. And I would say that the election of Donald Trump in November 2024 was also by definition the defeat of Kamala Harris. As the Trump administration engages in its expansive attempt to remake the American state in the post-Obama world order, it seems a bit beside the point to think about the meaning, if any, of Harris's defeat, given the rapid changes that are happening at this moment. Within the past month, the Trump administration has moved aggressively to dismantle what some have called the civil rights state. So I'm actually going to share my screen. Great. So starting with 3 executive orders in January 20th and 21st, 2025, Donald Trump moved to aggressively dismantle those elements of the administrative state that didn't comport with his anti-DEI campaign. He defunded federally funded research, or they're trying to defund federally funded research that triggers a keyword watch list. And as of February 14th, 2025, the Department of Education sent a Dear Colleague letter, which sharply limited the ability of higher institutions that receive federal funding to engage in diversity or DEI efforts. So I'm going to argue that history offers us a way of thinking through this moment. I suggest that Harris's defeat, as well as Trump 2.0, allows us a lens to both understand not only the future development of American politics, but the ways in which past developments led to this junction point. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch out the rise and fall of what I call Black politics. And I argue that Black politics was a function of the mid to late 20th century political and state development. And I would suggest that not understanding the rise and decline of Black politics made the Democratic Party misjudge the depth and breadth of its support, as well as the depth and breadth of its opposition. And the second purpose of this historical account is to perhaps discern some historical possibilities that may prove instructive as we embark on this new political era. So what do I mean by Black politics? Black politics, I will argue, refers to the political practices, ideologies, and movements that are rooted in the experiences, struggles, and interests of Black individuals and communities. Black politics seeks to address both historical and contemporary issues, aiming for the empowerment and liberation of Black people. It is shaped by intersectionality, the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, migration status. Black politics can take many formal and informal, singular as well as overlapping practices, from rebellion to grassroots activism, to rent strikes, boycotts, and protest marches, to participation in formal political structures like electoral politics and office holding. Of course, any definition of Black politics must acknowledge that defining who or what is Black is fraught with both social and political controversy. Race or racial definitions, when applied to, in the American case, race, when applied to people of Asian or Latin American descent, has been the subject of litigation. By contrast, the definition of Blackness has been fairly stable for generations, a product of the USA's embrace of chattel slavery and of hypodescent. That is the one-drop rule. I will also say that Black politics rests on, is intertwined with the civil rights movement, civil rights politics, even as it exhibits its own characteristics. They are two sides of the same coin. So what I'm going to try to really quickly sketch out over the next, say, 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, is that I'm going to argue that Black politics is really the development is the product of four developments. First, the progressive era impact on the American federal system, which enhanced the roles of states as laboratories of democracy, as well as illiberalism. Second, this 20th century transformation of the separation of power system with its ascendant judiciary and executive. Third, the mass urbanization and industrialization of the United States, the US state, cresting by 1930. And then finally, the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to points north and west from 1910 to 1970. Together, what I argue is that these four developments create the conditions for Black politics to emerge. In turn, the rise of Black politics would play a role in reshaping the political institutional development of the American state. And again, I'm going to go through about 100 years of political history really quickly. But what I want you to think about is just four sort of points. First, I'll talk about what's often called the nadir, or the end of post-emancipation politics and the instantiation of the Jim Crow order centered in the South, but spread across the USA. Second, I'll talk about the emergence of Black politics, a period roughly spanning from 1910 to 1945. And then third, what I call the balance of power era, roughly spanning from 1950 to 1965, with both the emergence of post-war liberalism and civil rights politics. And then fourth, the Black Power era, roughly 1965 to about 1980, which I argued reshaped American liberalism and the American party system. And then finally, the fifth era, what I call the neoliberal era from 1980 to 2008, with the Obama coda of 2008 to 2016. So it's a lot of American political history, but hopefully you'll be able to bear with me. So I'm going to start with this first era, this most critical era, which is the nadir, or what I call the nadir, the end of a certain kind of Black politics and the rebirth of a new kind of Black politics. The historian Rayford Logan called this era from the end of Reconstruction to 1901, the nadir of Black American political life. In the South, the Jim Crow order rested on the civic and social death of Black Americans. This is caused by four things that happened in a fairly compressed period of about 10 years. First, in 1890 was the failure of the Lodge Force Act in 1890, or the Federal Elections Bill, which provided for the federal regulation of elections to the U.S. House of Representatives. In many ways, what's really remarkable about this election bill is that it really reflects what would be enacted nearly a century later in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the image that you see hopefully on your screen is called The Political Pinkertons by the political cartoonist Grant Hamilton. A caption in the accompanying magazine says, "The Northern press is unanimous in condemnation of the protest of the employment of Pinkertons against labor in the North, but who hears a word of protest from the Southern press against this band of organized bulldozers and murderers that sacrifice thousands of lives every year?" The various posters on the wall read, "Vote inside, no Negro votes taken. The Constitution gives the Negro the right to vote, but what care we for the Constitution? Voting done inside by whites only, KKK." So really, this is this moment that it's the beginning of this sort of erasure of Black Americans from particularly Southern political life. The second moment is a couple of years later in 1895, when Booker T. Washington gives his infamous Atlanta Compromise speech, in which one of the key things that he says, and what most famous for saying is, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, and all things essential to mutual progress." He also follows this up with saying, "The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house." So this is the beginning of a certain kind of accommodationism pushed by Booker T. Washington. There's a lot of pushback, of course, from folks who are living within and outside of the South, saying that, what we don't need is accommodation. What we do need is actually more forceful enforcement of civil rights laws than on the books. Very quickly, on the heels of Booker T. Washington's speech is the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896, which essentially codifies separate and equal, or sorry, separate but equal. And then this is followed fairly quickly by 1901 with the farewell speech of George Henry White, the last Black African-American member of Congress who leaves Congress in 1901 and leaves Congress essentially making a plea to say that Phoenix-like African-Americans will rise up someday and come again. And so this is this moment of the 1890s where really it's the ushering out of post-Reconstruction politics, and what comes next is still very much up in the air. What comes up in the air is really migration. So migration is just basically reshapes the sort of political landscape for African Americans and certainly for all others. Just to give you some numbers, in 1920, New York City, which by then had the largest population of African Americans, the population of African Americans went from 150,000 to 327,000, almost doubling by 1930. The same thing happened in Chicago. In Chicago, the Black population went from 109,000 to 233,000. Philadelphia, 134,000 to 200,000. Detroit, 41,000 to 120,000. And Los Angeles, 16,000 to 29,000. So suddenly what happens then is that you have this massive influx of African Americans into these cities outside of the South. And I want to say that migration wasn't easy. Local groups, including Black settlement houses, scrambled to help migrants settle into their new homes, while new groups like the National Urban League emerged to coordinate an organized response to migration and help migrants become acculturated to urban life. And I would also say that migration was also not particularly welcome. Sorry about that. It was initially met with political violence, with the Red Summer of 1919, which experienced at least 38 race riots, leaving hundreds of people dead and millions in property damage, as well as the nationwide resurgence of the KKK. Nevertheless, what's really important about this moment is that it really sort of begins this sort of rethinking about what a Black political life could be in this new century. So certainly World War I was helpful in terms of helping this idea of Black patriotism, the idea of closing ranks, and that African Americans were fighting for democracy. It also led to the new Negro movement, which created the Harlem as well as the Chicago Renaissance that many of us know about. And again, it also led to the establishment of new civic groups, in addition to the National Urban League, other groups like the NAACP, as well as Black labor organizations like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. Within the veil of these now Jim Crow cities is the emergence of what the historian Earl Lewis calls the congregation of spaces. That is created within the walls of segregation was the creation of a Black modern counterpublic of shared purpose, meaning, and communications. Black churches, civic organizations, the Black press, Black leisure and entertainment, businesses, fraternal organizations, and mutual aid societies. Again, what I want to give a sense of is that really there's this emergence of a sort of alternate world of that is emerging within the veil of segregation. This segregation, this emergence of a sort of a new Black urban proletariat, if you will, is institutionalized in some sense in 1924 with the end of mass migration from Europe. And so really it leaves African Americans in this kind of somewhat slightly more advantageous position vis-a-vis urban labor markets outside of the South. And then migration leads to what I call this sort of new Black urban citizenship. I just want to sort of focus on two things. One is Representative White, the last African American representative in the post-Reconstruction era, leaves office in 1901. 29 years later, the first African American representative is elected in Chicago. Oscar DePriest, elected in 1914, first as a Black city council member, and then 1929, he's elected to Congress as the first Black member of Congress since Reconstruction. This election of DePriest is notable because he's not the only one. That is, migration has enabled a sufficient number of African Americans to live in cities, and especially in places where the vote hasn't been restricted. And they're now then able to enter into the political life of these cities. Again, not at a fully equal level, but certainly more political engagement and possibilities than existed at that moment in the South. So one example of this return to political life was the introduction of anti-lynching bills in the 1920s. Now, this is really fascinating because the first anti-lynching bill is introduced to Congress in 1918, and it's introduced by Leonidas Dyer, a white representative in St. Louis, who introduces an anti-lynching bill because suddenly his district is majority African American. And so this is the first bill, sort of civil rights bill, if you will, that appears in Congress that actually has significant backing in Congress, again, for the first time since 1901. And so again, all this is happening because African Americans are now outside of the South and able to sort of parlay their geographic spatial concentration into some form of political activism. We see this expanding, these possibilities expanding in the New Deal, where Black urban citizenship and the development of Black counterpublic leads to a small entree into the executive office. And here I'm talking about Roosevelt's Black cabinet, in which for the first time, really since probably Teddy Roosevelt's era, Black leadership had some sort of ability to have direct conversations with the American president over issues around civil rights. In 1941, this culminated in FDR issuing Executive Order 8802, which banned discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and all unions and companies engaged in war-related work. In many ways, this was the first DEI order. This action on the part of FDR came, partly out of political calculation. and partly because of Black pressure. So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which had emerged again in 1920, had been founded in 1925, threatened a march on Washington to shut down sort of war-related production if African Americans were not allowed their fair share of wartime employment. FDR issued the order, and the march was called off. But this march, the threatened march, reflected a very rapid shift, politically speaking, from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party on the part of African Americans. So for the first time, 75% of Blacks who could vote voted solidly for the Democratic Party. So whereas the Black African Americans had been solidly in support of the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln, by FDR's second term, they decisively turned towards the Democratic Party. And indeed, Oscar DePriest, who had been elected in 1929 as a Republican member of Congress, was defeated in 1934 by Arthur Mitchell, who became the first African American to be elected as a Democrat to Congress, and again from Chicago. So the second era that we then talk about is what I call the balance of power era. And this existed from 1945 to 1965 and was a strategy built upon Black Americans' experience in World War II and the renewed wave of Black migration outside of the South, fueled by wartime spending and the modernization of Southern agriculture, which displaced millions of Black farmers. And so the Great Migration is still happening, partly because Southern agriculture has become mechanized and changes within New Deal production have agricultural support programs has actually shifted a large proportion or pushed off a large proportion of African Americans out of farms and into cities. And given that this is World War II, they're going to cities where there's a lot of wartime production and a demand for labor. So this Great Migration, the next phase of the Great Migration is even more impressive in terms of numbers. So, for example, where New York City had 458,000 African Americans in 1940, by 1950, 757,000. And again, you can see these massive numbers. Chicago goes from 277 to 492,000. Philadelphia, 250,000 to 375,000. Detroit, 300,000 to 482,000. And LA, which had only 64,000 African Americans in 1940, grows to 200,000. So really this, again, this almost doubling again of Black population. So into this moment of hyper-patriotism in many ways, or sort of a cautious hyper-patriotism on the part of African Americans, Henry Lee Moon emerges. So Henry Lee Moon he had worked for various New Deal agencies and was an organizer for the CIO before becoming the NAACP's director of publicity. And he sets out a really intriguing idea. That is, what he argues is that important national policies and issues may be debated, developed, and formulated on the national level, but in America, they're settled only in the community, back home in the neighborhoods, precincts, and wards where the people live. So he's really making this case that there is a possibility, not only a possibility, but the reality of a Black urban politics rooted in neighborhoods, rooted in the wards, and rooted in the city councils that is really revolutionary because it hadn't existed really since the Reconstruction era. Moon would argue that African Americans, though often marginalized, had the potential to act as a balance of power in elections. And the idea was that in key swing states or districts, Black voters could tip the scales between political parties, thereby forcing both parties to consider the issues that are important to Black communities. Moon and others, including the NAACP, argued that competition for Black voters would expand the civil rights movement, both by reinforcing the emergent left turn within the Democratic Party and encouraging Republicans in competitive districts to endorse civil rights agendas. Of course, this had its critics who charged that elected officials would probably more often than not betray their campaign promises to support racial equality. And they also noted that the Republican Party often found support in resistance to civil rights changes. So again, it's not a perfect strategy, but certainly it's a strategy in which there's a certain kind of hope that this new geographic kind of spatial concentration within cities outside of the South would enable African Americans to perhaps have a little bit of leverage within the broader electoral system. So what are the results of under the balance of power scenario? First, Black voters become influential in national contests. So if you were to read any sort of article about the sort of Democratic Party coalition building during the 1950s and early 1960s, Blacks include, and as well as union members, as well as white ethnic voters, all become part of this broad kind of New Deal coalition. The presence of African Americans in some ways helped to push the Democratic Party, the broad Democratic Party, farther to the left in terms of race, despite Southern politicians, and despite some Southern politicians defecting and creating by 1948 the Dixiecrat Party. Black votes spur Truman's desegregation order and the president in 1948, as well as the establishment of the Truman's President's Committee on Human Rights. Black voters and Black political activism certainly played a role in terms of the court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and particularly plays a role in Eisenhower's order to send U.S. troops in to address the desegregation crisis in Little Rock in 1957. At the state level, Black voters matter as well. At the state level, they help give urban politicians an edge in state politics, especially at gubernatorial elections between upstate and downstate factions, between urban and as well as the urban and rural cleavages that had worsened during the early part of the 20th century. The presence of Black voters helped to spur what I would call a mini rights revolution at the state level, with subnational civil rights laws enacted across a significant number of states, including public accommodations laws enacted in 31 states, fair employment laws in 28 states, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so I'm running out of time, and I really want to sort of make sure I get to the end of this. So what happens next then is kind of not more of the same, but really kind of an interesting breakpoint, which is that certainly by the late 1950s, early 1960s, you have this tension between a kind of a mainstream democratic liberalism, which embraces in many ways the civil rights movement, and sees the civil rights movement as a way of kind of knitting together a much stronger, a broader New Deal coalition. Yet this broad civil rights coalition is in tension with the reality of urban politics. So these two images are an image. The first one on your left is an image from the Detroit Walk to Freedom March held in 1963. And if you sort of were able to look closely, what you'd see is essentially the mayor of Detroit, a young liberalish Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh, marching with other white state officials, as well as Martin Luther King. And the idea was that they're marching for freedom in the South. The idea that there's inequality, deep-seated inequality and segregation in the North remains wholly unaddressed by this emergent coalition. To your right is an image of Malcolm X, who essentially several months after this march has been conducted, gives his famous from the grassroots speech, which he essentially calls out Northern inequality, Northern segregation, and the sort of limits of civil rights approaches outside of the South. This destabilization, if you will, of the civil rights movement comes to its head by 1965 and 1966. So to your left is actually an image of a young Bernie Sanders who is being arrested as Martin Luther King and the Southern Leadership make a choice to move to the South, because they realize that, and this is, I think, a great quote from Martin Luther King, in the South, we always had segregationists to make issues clear. this ghetto Negro has been, the ghetto Negro has been invisible so long and has become visible through violence. And so King is really echoing the arguments made by Malcolm X and others for saying, hey, yes, things are terrible in the South, but actually things are terrible in the North as well, or outside of the South. On your left is actually an image of King after he's been hit by a rock. He had actually been marching through an all-white neighborhood on Chicago's west side where he was struck with a bottle or a rock. It's not quite clear what hit him. And King would state afterwards, I've seen many demonstrations in the South, but I've never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today. And so we get to this moment then of a kind of a more explosive Black urban politics with the emergence of the Black Power movement. And this really is a direct challenge to the sort of more liberal, moderate, democratic urban administrations outside of the South, and really a sense that these urban administrations really had not been able to address the issues, the really deep-rooted structures of inequality and segregation that limited many African Americans' lives in these cities. And so what you get then is just what we call the Black Power movement, right? The Black Power, the moment, which there's just lots of protests, but actually deliberate attempts to think about what would it mean to have Black control over political institutions and organizations. And so, as you can see from the slide, you have, for example, this is a bit from one of the sort of Black Power manifestos, trying to define what Black Power is. And this is, I think, an interesting way of thinking about it. First, obviously, Black Power is the growth of Negro political power, but it's the building of economic power. It's the improvement of self-image. It's the development of leadership. It's the encouragement of federal law enforcement and the mobilization of consumer power. So it really is seen as something that's going beyond the sort of traditional limit of voting to something that really is encompassing how do we rethink the role of African Americans, both in politics and society. So that gets us to, I think, the end of it, really, of this Black Power moment, which comes, certainly, I think, begins with the election of Jimmy Carter, but then really sort of comes to an end with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. From 1980 to 1990, I'll wait on that. Essentially, the Republican administrations imposed a cut of 46%, or some $26 billion in constant 1990 dollars, to grants and programs that benefited cities. So what you see is the sort of emergence of kind of a Keynesian, an urban Keynesianism, especially for Black cities and Black spaces, essentially gets completely dismantled by 1990 by Reagan. And then by the turn of the 21st century, a neoliberal urban order has emerged, which rested on austerity, mass incarceration, dispossession, gentrification, and the privatization of public goods like education and affordable housing. So this kind of upsurge in Black urbanism, Black urban citizenship gets really, in some ways, defanged by neoliberalism. And also by the reverse migration of the movement of African Americans out of cities. And so what you get then, I think, is this really curious moment of Black politics in which the kind of urban, mass-based politics that we saw from arguably 1930 to 1980 or so gets kind of transformed into essentially Obamaism, right? So Obama becomes the face of Black politics in many ways. And I think what I really like about this image is that Obama comes to office with this incredibly extraordinary high expectations, right? That Obama is going to be sort of the new FDR. He certainly wasn't. And in many ways, in terms of Obama's relationship with Black voters, it's tricky. So the upper right-hand corner of your image, of your screen, is an image of the infamous beer summit, in which Henry Louis Gates is sitting down having a beer with a white officer who had detained Gates as Gates was trying to enter into his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At the table is Obama, and then on the left is Joe Biden. What also I think marks kind of a curious kind of transition in Black politics during this moment is that Obama is really sort of the emergence of the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, in which when he makes a comment about Trayvon Martin looking like he could have been his son, he runs into a storm of sort of opposition. And so in many ways, then Obama is sort of the end, could be seen as kind of an end of Black politics, that it's a Black politics that's not necessarily linked to Black urban voters, but it's a politics of sort of more broadly about a politics of identity, and in some ways a politics of perhaps nostalgia. I've gone way over, but I think what I would like to leave with is thinking about the election of Donald Trump and the racial backlash he sort of embodied. In many ways, uh, uh, Donald Trump, Donald Trump's embrace of anti-DEI is, I think, a reflection of a kind of a lack of consensus, at least perhaps in the Democratic Party, about what race could or should mean. And here I'm thinking about someone like Bernie Sanders, who saw the future path for the Democratic Party through a much more explicit socially democratic platform, focusing on raising the minimum wage, Medicare for all, and later a Green New Deal. This, I think, approach really alarmed, I think, centrists, particularly because centrists identified Black voters as being kind of the core of the most reliable voters in the Democratic coalition. And so it ends up being sort of a curious thing, right? That the Democratic Party holds on to race even as race becomes or anti-DEI or racialism becomes something that is powering the Republicans, but doesn't seem to help the Democrats as much. I would also add that the sort of, even though Black voters are central to the Democratic coalition, Black urban voters are increasingly not central. That is, if you look at that, one of the things that happens from 1990 to 2020 is dramatic declines in the number of Black voters in American cities. And so one of the things is that we have, I think, a Democratic Party strategy that depends on a certain arrangement of coalition voters that might not be literally in the same places in which they existed beforehand. So I want to leave with perhaps a last thought, which is where do we go from here? I'm not quite sure. I think that one of the things we need to think about, or at least the Democratic Party needs to think about, is certainly how do we think about race in a now officially colorblind or very color conscious in a way era. What you see on your screen is an editorial from the Wall Street Journal. And in many ways, it's making the case that, hey, here's a new way of thinking about what racial empowerment might mean, self-reliance, stable families, and education. Can the Democratic Party come out with a message that empowers people, but also is true to perhaps its previous commitments to multicultural and multiracial democracy? So I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully, we can have some great conversations.
Thank you so much for that really, really insightful and fascinating lecture, Kim. I am going to start a Q&A session now. So I just encourage everyone who's joining online, if you click the Q&A button on the bottom, it should be on the bottom of your screen, you can submit a question and I can read it out on your behalf to Professor Johnson. One of the great things about chairing events is that you get to kick off the Q&A. So I'm going to ask the first question. And I just wanted to know that if in the second Trump era, are we likely to see a resurgence in Black political activism away from mainstream electoral politics? And if so, are there any lessons from modern American history that might indicate what a successful strategy might be?
That's such a great question. I mean, I think that one of the things that certainly came out during the first Trump administration, and you can also look in the past, is that often at moments where certain groups feel completely shut out or majorly shut out of political systems, there's a lot of organizing that has to happen, and a lot of sort of experimentation. And so I think one of the things that will happen is that there will be a lot of experimentation about new types of organizing, new types of institution building. We think of organizations like the NAACP as being sort of these venerable organizations that have always been around, but in fact, the NAACP was created in 1910 because it was seen that there wasn't kind of an effective advocacy organization for the issues that we're facing, not just African Americans, but other minority groups at that moment. There was also the establishment during this kind of 1890s moment of what I think I call the Black counterpublic. So historically Black colleges and universities, the Black press. And so I think not just in the US case, but I think in other cases, what we might see is, again, the sort of creation of new types of spaces that will enable political organizing to take place.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. I'll ask another question and just again let everybody know that they can put their own questions in the Q&A box by clicking on the bottom of their screen. So I guess another question from me would be, you opened the lecture by saying, it's another question on sort of contemporary politics, I guess, but you opened the lecture by saying that the election of Trump in November 2024 was also by definition a defeat of Kamala Harris. And the media has made a lot about the role that gender played in that election, and indeed the role that gender played in the previous election with a female candidate in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. So I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how race, ethnicity, gender all intersected in the 2024 campaign? Are there parallels, be they positive or negative, to be drawn between Kamala Harris's experience as a candidate and either Barack Obama's experience in 2008 or Hillary Clinton's experiences in 2016?
I think it's really interesting is that I think the Harris experience was more like Hillary Clinton's than Barack Obama. And I say that because I think Obama certainly had his detractors, but he also, I think, had an enormous amount of key figures who stepped in and said, hey, he's a great guy. There's a famous moment where John McCain is talking to he's giving a town hall, and someone raises their hand and says, well, isn't he an Arab, or isn't he a Muslim, or something like that? And McCain says, no, he's an American. He's a good man. He's an American. And I think that Obama had simply one less thing to reassure voters about. Whereas I think both for Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, the issue of gender was sort of there, but there was, I think, no way to sort of say, well, she's great for a woman without it sort of sounding very strange and awkward. And so I think that kind of reassurance couldn't really be done, and or perhaps shouldn't have had to be done. And so I think in many ways, I think while Harris's race played a role, I think gender played an equal, if not more significant role in her defeat.
Interesting. Thank you. So we have had a couple of questions come in. So I'm going to go first with Anna Pig's question. She says, thanks for the great talk. And she asks, do you think Black politics is evolving differently at federal and state levels in the current moment?
Yes. But I'd say that for most politics, I think that I think what uh, will sort of exemplify this coming era, I think will be this really split between the sort of national level and sort of state and local levels. I think, and we saw, I think, a little bit in terms of the COVID moment, where we see this just wide divergence in what the national government's saying and what state governments are saying. And I think in many ways, this will be even more so in the sense that particularly, I think blue states will say, well, listen, like we have our own voters and we're going to sort of try to sort of navigate a path that satisfies the demands of our own voters. And I think, certainly people who are, whether they're in a red state or a blue state, I think are seeing that the sort of contraction of the national government means that a lot of policy will be happening at the state and local level. And so I think that's kind of where where really intense politics will probably start to happen, is at the state and local level.
I guess I have a follow-up on that. Do you think that on the issue of Black politics or minority representation, that could fuel a pushback from the federal government towards certain blue states that might try and advance certain policies that the federal government are deeply opposed to or are trying to roll back?
Probably. I think that certainly, the current administration, I think, has a very particular sense of what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of local and politics. For example, Trump just is trying to cancel congestion pricing in New York City, which is so hyper local. But again, I think it's sort of the idea of policies that don't really comport with their sort of broader political agenda is something that they are not comfortable with. And so I think there will be an attempt to sort of impose kind of a top-down attempt to sort of blunt attempts by blue states, for example, to do things that are not in comportment with what the administration wants. But, right now it's still up in the air about whether the extent to which blue states and blue localities can resist that.
Yes. Interesting. Okay, a question from William Dutton. He says that VP Harris came very close in the 2024 election. Is she missing an opportunity to play an influential role in opposition to Trump? She seems to have disappeared. That's something I've noticed as well. She's kind of left the stage. Is that a missed opportunity, do you think?
I think well, there's two things. One is so let me sort of more specific and then work outward. So I think that's not unusual. Usually the losing candidate just disappears, right? So Carter, in fact, wasn't even invited to a number of Democratic conventions until fairly recently. Mondale disappeared. I mean, I think there's just a sense that you've done it, and in many ways you're reminding voters of the party loss. And so I think there's sort of a tacit understanding that that's not doing anything productive. But more broadly speaking, I think that the loss in 2016, the sort of disarray around Biden's stepping out of the race, and then the sort of very clear, Trump won the popular vote and he won the electoral vote. I mean, I think that really has posed almost an existential challenge to the Democratic Party leadership. I mean, they've largely been absent. And I really think it's because we're in a moment of party leadership transition. I think we have a senior leadership that came to power before Obama, maybe Clinton, or certainly during Obama era. And I think my opinion is that they kind of don't really know what to do. And so I think one of the things that might happen is that we might get a DLC type of transition. So the DLC is the Democratic Leadership Council that emerges in the 1980s in the wake of these sort of huge defeats of the Democratic Party, Mondale, getting completely blown out of the water by Reagan. And so the DLC comes in and essentially says, we need to rethink the Democratic Party message. We need to rethink Democratic Party leadership. And so I think that's probably what's going to happen, is that there's going to be a struggle over the direction of the party. And one reason I think why you see the absence of Democratic Party leadership is that no one really wish, I think no one, I don't think, I'm not sure they really know what to say.
Hmm.
And I don't think they
Yeah,
really
I
know
guess,
how to respond.
yeah, that relates to another thing I wanted to ask you. A lot was made of the role that Barack Obama played in the 2024 election, trying to mobilize Black voters. And there was a lot of media commentary about his sort of unique, enduring appeal in that community. Obviously, it ultimately wasn't successful because Harris lost the campaign. So, do you think that using Obama in that way in 2024 was helpful to the Democrats? And is it a strategy that they might want to pursue again in the future?
Um, I think that in many ways they were trying to recreate this sort of magic moment of 2008. But it's not quite 20 years later, but close to. And I think I was struck by this moment where Obama basically went to, I think, a barber shop and sort of lectured young African American men. And I was thinking, well, they weren't, like, maybe they were five, maybe they were, I mean, they were kids when he was president. Um, and I
Yeah.
think there's a certain kind of out of touchness um,
Mm.
that emerged out of that conversation. And I think particularly thinking about, the manosphere, the sort of alternate social media that sort of is, consumed by particularly young men and including young Black men. And I think that, Obama was kind of presenting a kind of vision which didn't really fit, I think, where young men, whether they're Black or white or Latino, kind of are. And so I think that there was a little bit of dissonance and kind of
Yeah.
deploying Obama and not realizing that he's maybe wasn't the best voice for the moment at hand.
No. No, that's very interesting. A couple of questions about the Republican Party. So one is
Mhm.
from Paul Williams. So he asks, what do you think the explanation is for so many Hispanic Americans voting for Trump? But I would just add to that, there seemed to be a lot of commentary about, as you said, some sections of the Black community voting for Trump as well. So is there an
Mhm.
explanation for that specifically? And Paul's question is specifically about Hispanics as well.
You know, I mean, I think it will be the subject of many, many, many books, but I mean, I think probably, you know, one of the, I think, perhaps missteps of the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party, I think, back in sort of the early 2000s, um, was, I think, that benefited from a census report that came out that said essentially, oh, people of color are going to be the majority of the American population. Um, and so in some ways, the Democratic Party went in on a sort of demography is destiny approach, which is that if you identify different groups, racial, ethnic groups, you could sort of cobble them together under this kind of identity coalition. Um, that didn't actually have to necessarily speak to what each identity kind of needed. And I think
Mhm.
that one of one of the I think one of the things that certainly scholars who look at immigration um, have noted is that for some groups, um, they don't stay immigrants, right? That some groups actually become assimilated, and some groups actually turn from, say, immigrant status to becoming and considering themselves to be white. And
Mm.
certainly, I think that if you were to look at some portions of the Latino community and some portions of the Asian American community, I don't think they necessarily embrace kind of a subordinate kind of immigrant status, but really see themselves as, well, I'm just an American. I'm a middle class American. And so I think that in some ways, the Republican Party has been able, despite its kind of um, rhetoric, has been able to kind of incorporate people who on the one hand might be considered minorities, but on the other hand, really sort of see themselves as kind of a generation beyond that kind of minoritized immigrant status.
Yeah, and my understanding of that's happened to previous waves of immigration as well, of
Right.
white ethnic groups that have moved to the United States that eventually stop sort of identifying as immigrants and see themselves as the majority. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Kind of the other side of the Republican Party question kind of comes from Gareth Johnson, who asks, can the GOP be described as colorblind when they have, I think, five black Republican representatives out of 200?
Well, I think that's the debate about what colorblind means, right? That there's a strand of republicanism that would argue that um, colorblind is literally colorblind, that there are Republican candidates who are black, but they're not black Republicans. There just happen to be Republicans who are black.
Mm-mm.
Um, I think there's an idea though that of color being kind of associated with status or race. Um, and certainly I think, when we think about anti-DEI rhetoric, um, it's about uh, a sense that it's not about color blindness, but about fairness, right? That somehow someone's identity has enabled them to sort of jump the queue. Um, so I think some Republicans I think have an idea about color blindness, which um, is perhaps more optimistic, right? That it really is sort of leaning into we're all equal, we're all Americans. Well, I think there are probably perhaps some conservatives or Republicans who um, see color blindness as a sort of color um, color awareness, if you will, which
Hmm.
yeah, or sort of kind of a color
I, I,
conservatism.
mhm. I'm going to ask a final sort of question on the Republicans and ethnic minority voting. Just since that shift towards ethnic minority groups voting overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, are there any other moments in the sort of latter half of the 20th century where Democrats felt as sort of um, threatened as the go-to place for ethnic minority voters? Is there any other moment that at another presidential election or another electoral cycle where that issue of Republicans gaining more ethnic minority votes came up? And if so, how did the party respond then?
No, I think what's interesting is that George W. Bush actually was a fairly popular governor
Mm,
of Texas, um, and made, significant had more support than one would think from the Hispanic communities in Texas. And there've been other uh, Republican governors uh, that, I think during the 80s and 90s, who were able to create broad coalitions that did include minority voters. I think that one of the things is that, that kind of big tent Republicanism has largely been pushed away by the Republican Party, although one could say that Trump 2.0 might be the resurgence of a kind of a bigger tent Republican Party. But I certainly think that, when you look at Republicans in, like someone like Chris Christie, for example, in New Jersey, I mean, he actually got, not zero support by racial and ethnic minorities. So I think that there's a certain kind of Republican that can kind of cobble together um,
mm,
a broader coalition, but certainly I think, it all depends on what the sort of general messaging from, say, the National Republican Party is doing.
okay. We should move on to something a little broader and I guess related to it's kind of a historical perspective, but it's a really interesting question from William again, William Dutton. Did Black politics have a strong international issue agenda over these different historical periods?
Um, Certainly. I mean, I think that there's an interesting way in which, particularly after World War II, um, that the case that civil rights activists make to advance the cause, if you will, is that they're saying, hey, we're in a Cold War. And the Soviet Union is, in fact, using racial inequality in the United States as a sort of as an example for why these sort of newly independent nations of Asia and Africa should align with the sort of Soviet bloc as opposed to the West. And so I think there's a way in which national policymakers are looking at how the Jim Crow system in the US is really being deployed against them, not only during World War II, but certainly during the Cold War. And civil rights activists are saying, hey, maybe you should sort of embrace sort of reform because you don't want to sort of give more propaganda to the Soviet bloc. So I think that's certainly one sense in which there's both an eye on sort of domestic politics, but an eye on how can sort of the sort of international scene affect us. But I think also certainly the sort of decolonialization of
Mm.
of uh, of former colonies in Asia and Africa were hugely influential in kind of thinking about, well, what should happen for African Americans. And certainly the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers are really, they have a very strong internationalist focus in terms of their
Mhm.
activities.
And I guess in more recent historical periods, so in the 21st century, have there been any sort of unique perspectives that Black or other ethnic minority voters might have on international issues that maybe aren't shared by the white population of the United States?
Um, I think that I think that in some ways, well, I think in an interesting kind of way, I think what was remarkable about the George Floyd protests, for example,
Mm.
is in some ways they were kind of a global protest. And I think that was wholly unexpected. I think that, people in the folks in the US sort of thought, oh, that's just like a very domestic issue. But I think what's interesting is that in the UK, in, France, in Brazil, that you had these sort of organic Black Lives Matter protests that are saying, hey, we have a problem with unequal policing and inequality and how do we sort of get our issues onto the agenda. So I think that is like kind of I think that's an interesting moment again that I don't think folks in the US particularly thought that the sort of that George Floyd's death would lead to kind of a more global response, and in those responses really kind of being key to the conditions within a particular country.
That's very interesting. Yes, and I think America has that unique ability to sort of have that global impact in terms of how its social
Right.
movements move beyond its borders. So I guess, do activists in the United States realize that they have that influence? And are they in turn influenced by the fact that movements like BLM go global?
I think yes and no. I think one of the things about BLM is that it was so decentralized. I think there
Mm,
were various people who purported to be the leaders of, but in many ways it was just, each city had its own BLM uh,
mm,
movement. And so I think that there were people who I think tried to make specific links to other groups and other movements in but I think it's tough because at its core, it really was about the conditions that were facing people in their communities. And I think that this is, I think that partly is sort of American sort of myopia that we can't really often see beyond our borders.
mm. Interesting. Okay, and I have a further question just on you talked about the civil rights state which Trump is trying to dismantle, and I guess the kind of end of the post-Obama world order. And I was wondering how robust do you think those systems are? And when the Trump era is over, will the civil rights state and will the kind of political order that Obama created or exemplified, will it withstand all of Trump's different assaults on them? How far can he really roll these things back, do you think, over the next couple of years?
That's such a good question. I think that, when I was putting this talk together, I was really struck by a number of parallels and then of the 1890s in which Reconstruction really you have things like Plessy, the failure of the uh, election bill, which just ends sort of political and sort of a certain kind of political and social life. I think that in many ways it's a little bit more difficult to do that. I mean, I think that the Black middle class is far larger and far more, I think, embedded in sort of American life um, than say in 1890. I think that um, going from recently enslaved to newly freed is quite different than going from segregated and somewhat equal to integrated and equal. So it's hard for me to imagine, and maybe I hope this is not famous last words. It's hard for me to imagine that um, we would ever return to like a pre-1954 level of kind of social and political and economic segregation. Um, I
Mm.
do think, though, that certainly um, barriers that had been sort of previously lessened will be sort of um, kept in place. And so I think that certainly if you so I think certainly there will be challenges. I think if you are considered a minority group member, that the mechanisms for enforcing um, or achieving some sort of equality will be a little tougher.
Mm. There's a sort of related question here from Ronald King that says, to many commentators, the Trump 2 administration represents a major shift in American politics, implying the death of the liberal agenda. If so, minor adjustments to Democratic Party positioning would be largely irrelevant. So has the UK entered a new political era, and to what extent do you agree, I guess, that America has just entered a completely new paradigm?
Um, I think it has. I mean, I think that even if um, a magic court would emerge and say, no, stop, stop the firing of federal employees, restore funding. I think that often we, I think particularly in the US, we ran on sort of vibes in some sense. So one of the things I talk about when I teach Intro to American Politics is I ask my students, well, if you were sending a package to another country, a country of your origin or a country where your relatives live, um, how um, how confident would you feel that that package would get there without it being opened or stolen? Um, and a significant number of my students who are from all over the world would say, I would never send a package to this particular country because I have no sort of trust in the government. Um, we in the United States, I think, have a lot of trust in our government, even though we say we don't trust government. Yeah, but the idea that you could put a check in the mail, right? And that check
Hmm.
will get to from New York City to California for, $2 is actually extraordinary. And so I think that one of the things that I fear is that enough damage has been done that people no longer trust in the government or they don't trust the future of government. Um, and a lot of things kind of rest on trust. Will that contract be honored? Can I go ahead and hire my postdocs if I'm not sure if the NIH or the NSF is going to suddenly change my funding um,
Hmm.
criteria? I mean, it's happened and you can't sort of take that back, right? You can't unring that bell.
Hmm. Do you think that in that context, or in the current political moment, that this is just a slight rephrasing on a question that's come in, that maybe Black political activists or the Democratic Party might speak a little bit less about a sort of Black vote and to try and maybe embrace the idea of a post-racial politics, or would that be uh, unlikely to happen, or maybe a bad idea? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Um, I think that they probably should try. I mean, I think that there's a hard limit, literally, on numbers of racial groups, right? Um, And I think it's also true that younger people think about race in a slightly different ways than, say, older people. And so it's not saying that race is irrelevant, but um, I think if one were to make political appeals based on race, I think you need to understand, well, what is race doing? What does race mean to a generation in which race, like gender, for example, is a lot more fluid, right? And
Mm.
so what do we think about that? How can we think about that?
That's really interesting. I think we're coming to the end of the questions, but there's one final question from Peggy Warren. And she refers to the activists themselves, many of whom have been involved in Black politics for decades and for their entire lives. Um, Peggy asks, is there any message that you would have for them, maybe particularly Black women? And I guess I would also ask, from a kind of historical perspectives, are there any other kind of historical parallels that maybe Black activists or Black female activists might take? Uh, some points of optimism from things that have happened in the past.
I mean, I think that, right now, I think the key um, thing for, I think, for all people is really digging deep into local politics and state level politics. I mean, I think that to the extent that um, one can draw a line or sort of get a measure of some responsiveness to policy concerns, that's going to happen at the local and state level. And I'd say that, historically, you know, looking at an example of anti-lynching laws. Like we didn't get an anti-lynching law enacted, but the very fact that it was able to be put onto the congressional agenda, despite Southern opposition, is really significant. So I think, and that came from local organizing. So I would say that um, now is not the time to, I mean, I think everyone needs a little bit of a break, but I mean, I think in the future, though, I think certainly building local organizations, thinking about alternative media um, and information sharing channels is probably what's going to be needed if the Democratic Party is going to regain any sort of sense of competitiveness.
Great. Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and I think a really fascinating Q&A discussion. And thanks to all the people joining us online who've submitted questions. I'll just bring things to a close by letting everyone know that the next online lecture that we'll be running at Balliol will be from Dr. Romain Ruzziconi, and the lecture will be entitled Apples, Black Holes, and Holograms, A Brief History of Gravity. So something completely different, but nonetheless interesting and exciting. That lecture will be held on Tuesday, the 20th of May, and all the details for signing up are available on Balliol's website. But thank you again, Professor Johnson, and thanks again to everyone who's joined us online.
It was
Have a nice
really a
evening.
pleasure. Have a nice evening.